In the flickering candlelight of his modest study in Sant'Andrea in Percasina, Niccolò Machiavelli hunched over parchment, his quill scratching against the coarse paper as he penned what would become one of history's most misunderstood warnings. The year was 1513, and the former Florentine secretary had already witnessed the spectacular rise and fall of Cesare Borgia, the machinations of Pope Julius II, and the endless cycle of Italian city-states destroying themselves through a particular kind of thinking that he had come to identify as the most dangerous pattern of human cognition. What Machiavelli observed in the palaces of Florence, Rome, and beyond was not merely political corruption or moral failing, but something far more insidious, a systematic way of thinking that invariably led to ruin. This thought pattern, which he would weave throughout the prince and his discourses, represented the fundamental error that separated successful leaders from those who found themselves exiled, imprisoned, or executed. Yet 5 centuries later, this warning remains largely unheeded, as individuals, organizations, and entire nations continue to fall prey to the same cognitive trap that Machiavelli identified with such clinical precision. The pattern begins with what appears to be rational calculation. A leader, whether of a Renaissance city-state or a modern corporation, faces a decision that could bring immediate advantage. The choice seems clear: act in accordance with noble principles and risk immediate disadvantage, or compromise those principles for tangible, measurable gain. What Machiavelli observed was that most leaders, when faced with this apparent dilemma, consistently chose the second option while telling themselves they were being pragmatic, realistic, and effective. But this was precisely the trap. Machiavelli's genius lay not in advocating for ruthless pragmatism, as centuries of misreading have suggested, but in identifying how this seemingly pragmatic thinking created a cascade of consequences that ultimately destroyed those who embraced it. The thought pattern he cautioned against was the belief that one could compartmentalize moral compromise, treating principles as luxuries to be discarded when convenient, without recognizing that this very mindset would corrupt the decision-maker's ability to accurately assess reality itself. Consider the case of Agathocles of Syracuse, whom Machiavelli analyzed with characteristic directness. Here was a leader who achieved tremendous short-term success through betrayal and violence, yet Machiavelli refused to call him a great prince. Why? Because Agathocles had fallen into the perilous thought pattern of believing that results justified methods without considering the systemic effects of his approach. Each act of betrayal made him more isolated, more dependent on fear rather than loyalty, and, ultimately more vulnerable to the very methods he had employed against others. This was the heart of Machiavelli's warning: the most dangerous thought pattern was not mere villainy, which at least recognized itself as such, but the sophisticated rationalization that convinced leaders they could engage in systematic deception and betrayal while maintaining their capacity for sound judgment. The thought pattern created a kind of cognitive blindness, where short-term tactical thinking overwhelmed strategic wisdom. In the merchant republics of his era, Machiavelli witnessed this pattern repeatedly. A trading house would begin by cutting corners on contracts, justifying it as necessary competition. The immediate profits would reinforce the behavior, leading to more sophisticated forms of deception. Over time, the merchants would lose the ability to distinguish between partners they could trust and those they could not, because their own behavior had trained them to assume everyone operated with the same compromised ethics. This cognitive corruption would eventually lead them to make catastrophic miscalculations, often trusting the wrong allies or missing opportunities because they could no longer accurately assess the character and motivations of others. The thought pattern Machiavelli identified operates on 3 interconnected levels, each reinforcing the others in a downward spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. The first level is tactical, the immediate rationalization of ethically questionable decisions based on short-term advantages. The second level is strategic, the gradual erosion of one's ability to inspire genuine loyalty and trust, leading to increased reliance on coercion and manipulation. The third level is cognitive, the systematic distortion of one's perception of reality, as the need to justify past compromises colors all future assessments. What made this pattern particularly perilous was its self-reinforcing nature. Each success achieved through compromise seemed to validate the approach, while each failure could be attributed to insufficient ruthlessness rather than to the fundamental flaws in the method itself. Machiavelli observed how leaders caught in this pattern would double down on increasingly extreme measures, convinced that their previous moderation had been the problem. The Prince of the Romagna, Cesare Borgia, provided Machiavelli with perhaps his most instructive case study. Initially, Borgia appeared to validate the efficacy of ruthless pragmatism. He conquered territories, eliminated enemies, and consolidated power with remarkable speed and efficiency. Machiavelli documented these achievements with apparent admiration, leading many readers to assume he was advocating for Borgia's methods. But a careful reading reveals something more subtle. Machiavelli was demonstrating how even a master practitioner of realpolitik could fall victim to the very thought pattern he seemed to have mastered. Borgia's downfall came not from external forces alone, but from the internal contradictions of his approach. His reliance on fear and manipulation had created a network of relationships based entirely on calculation rather than genuine loyalty. When circumstances shifted, when his father Pope Alexander VI died unexpectedly, and Pope Julius II proved hostile, Borgia found himself without true allies. Everyone around him was prepared to abandon or betray him because that was precisely the kind of relationship he had cultivated. His sophisticated understanding of power politics had blinded him to the possibility that authentic relationships might have provided a more stable foundation for his rule. This was the essence of Machiavelli's warning. The thought pattern that prioritized immediate tactical advantage over long-term strategic wisdom invariably created the conditions for its own destruction. The leader who believed they could manipulate others without being corrupted by the practice inevitably found that their capacity for sound judgment had been compromised by their own methods. Part 2, The Mechanics of Cognitive Corruption. The second aspect of Machiavelli's analysis focused on how this perilous thought pattern operated within the mind of the leader. It was not simply a matter of moral failing, though moral considerations were certainly involved. Rather, Machiavelli identified a systematic process by which certain types of thinking gradually undermine the leader's capacity for effective decision-making. The process begins with what Machiavelli termed the separation of appearance from reality. A leader facing pressure might decide to present a false front while privately maintaining their true principles. This seems harmless enough. After all, every leader must sometimes conceal their intentions for strategic reasons. But Machiavelli observed that this practice, when it became habitual, created a dangerous split in the leader's consciousness. In the courts of the Medici, Machiavelli had witnessed how this split operated. A courtier might begin by flattering the prince while privately maintaining their honest assessment of the ruler's capabilities. Over time, however, the courtier would find it increasingly difficult to maintain this dual consciousness. The constant performance of deference would gradually shape their actual perceptions, until they could no longer distinguish between their strategic flattery and their genuine assessment. This was not mere hypocrisy, it was a fundamental corruption of the courtier's capacity for independent judgment. The same process operated at the level of leadership. A prince who began by strategically presenting themselves as more virtuous than they actually were would gradually lose touch with their own authentic character. The performance would begin to shape the performer, but in a particularly destructive way. Rather than the performance elevating the person to match their projected image, the constant maintenance of the false front would erode their connection to whatever genuine virtues they possessed. Machiavelli observed this phenomenon most clearly in the ecclesiastical principalities of his era. Church leaders who began their careers with genuine spiritual conviction would gradually find themselves so immersed in political calculation that they lost touch with the very principles that had originally motivated them. They would continue to speak the language of virtue and spirituality, but these words would become hollow performances, divorced from any authentic understanding or commitment. This cognitive corruption manifested itself in several specific ways that Machiavelli documented with clinical precision. First, leaders caught in this pattern would develop what he termed the blindness of success. When their manipulative strategies achieved short-term victories, they would attribute these successes to their superior understanding of human nature, rather than recognizing the role of luck, circumstance, or the specific contexts that made their methods temporarily effective. Second, they would develop an increasingly cynical view of human nature that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Convinced that everyone was motivated purely by self-interest, they would structure all their relationships around that assumption. This would naturally attract and empower the most cynical and self-serving individuals, while repelling those capable of genuine loyalty and principled action. The leader would then point to the behavior of their associates as confirmation of their worldview, never recognizing that they had systematically selected for the very characteristics they claimed to observe universally. Third, they would lose the capacity for accurate self-assessment. The constant practice of strategic deception would make it increasingly difficult to distinguish between their public persona and their private reality. They would begin to believe their own propaganda, not because they were naive, but because the cognitive effort required to maintain the distinction became unsustainable. This would lead them to make increasingly unrealistic assessments of their own capabilities and the loyalty of their supporters. The tragic irony that Machiavelli identified was that leaders who adopted this thought pattern in pursuit of greater effectiveness actually became less effective over time. Their corrupted perception would lead them to misread situations, misjudge people, and miscalculate consequences. They would find themselves surrounded by flatterers and opportunists while driving away the very advisors who might have provided them with accurate information and sound counsel. Perhaps most dangerously, they would lose the capacity to recognize when circumstances had changed and their methods were no longer appropriate. Machiavelli observed how leaders who had achieved success through deception and manipulation would continue to rely on these methods even when their situations called for different approaches. They would apply the same tactics whether they were facing enemies or potential allies, whether they were operating from positions of strength or weakness, whether they were dealing with sophisticated political actors or simple, honest people. This inflexibility was not mere stubbornness, but a direct result of the cognitive corruption that Machiavelli had identified. The thought pattern that prioritized tactical manipulation over strategic wisdom gradually destroyed the leader's capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. They would become like generals fighting the last war, applying outdated methods to new situations because their capacity for accurate assessment had been compromised by their own practices. Machiavelli's analysis extended beyond individual psychology to encompass the broader effects on governance and society. A leader trapped in this thought pattern would create institutions that reflected their distorted worldview. They would build systems based on the assumption that everyone was motivated purely by fear and self-interest, because that was the only form of motivation they could still recognize or effectively employ. These institutions would then shape the behavior of everyone within them, creating a cultural environment that validated the leader's cynical assumptions. Citizens and subjects would learn to interact with power through the same calculating, self-interested lens that their ruler employed. This would create a society characterized by widespread cynicism, low trust, and constant maneuvering for advantage, exactly the kind of environment that made effective governance most difficult. The result was what Machiavelli termed a corruption of the people, by which he meant not moral degradation in the abstract sense, but a systematic undermining of the civic virtues necessary for stable, effective governance. When leaders modeled and rewarded calculating self-interest over principled action, they would inevitably create societies that became ungovernable through any means other than increasing levels of coercion and manipulation. This created a vicious cycle. As society became more cynical and calculating, leaders felt justified in employing increasingly ruthless methods. These methods would further corrupt both the leaders and their societies, requiring even more extreme measures to maintain order and achieve objectives. The end result was the kind of political chaos that Machiavelli had witnessed throughout Italy, where constant warfare, betrayal, and instability had made effective governance nearly impossible. Part 3, The Alternative Path and its Contemporary Relevance. In the final section of his analysis, Machiavelli outlined what he saw as the alternative to this perilous thought pattern. Contrary to the common interpretation that presents him as an advocate for amoral pragmatism, Machiavelli actually argued for a more sophisticated understanding of how virtue and effectiveness could be reconciled in practice. His solution was not naive idealism, but what might be called enlightened realism, an approach that recognized the harsh realities of power while avoiding the cognitive trap that destroyed so many leaders. The key insight was that truly effective leadership required maintaining what Machiavelli called the unity of appearance and reality. This did not mean naive honesty or the kind of transparent simplicity that could be easily exploited by more cynical actors. Rather, it meant developing a character that was genuinely aligned with one's public presentation, so that strategic thinking and ethical consideration could operate in harmony rather than in conflict. Machiavelli pointed to several historical examples of leaders who had achieved this integration successfully. Marcus Aurelius, though he ruled in a very different context, demonstrated how philosophical reflection and practical effectiveness could reinforce each other. Rather than compartmentalizing his Stoic principles and his imperial responsibilities, Marcus Aurelius had developed a way of thinking that brought these elements into alignment. His private meditations reveal a leader constantly working to understand how his principles could guide his practical decisions, rather than seeing them as obstacles to be overcome. Similarly, Machiavelli admired certain aspects of how Moses had managed the seemingly impossible task of transforming a slave population into an effective nation. The key was that Moses had understood the relationship between immediate practical necessities and long-term character formation. He had recognized that sustainable success required building institutions and cultural practices that would shape people's behavior in constructive ways, rather than simply relying on coercion or manipulation to achieve immediate compliance. What these examples demonstrated was a fundamentally different approach to the relationship between means and ends. Instead of viewing ethical considerations as external constraints on effectiveness, truly sophisticated leaders learned to see them as essential elements of long-term strategic thinking. They understood that the means employed would inevitably shape the character of both the leader and the led, and that these character effects would determine what kinds of ends were ultimately achievable. This was perhaps Machiavelli's most radical insight, that the thought pattern he warned against was not just morally problematic, but strategically ineffective over any meaningful time horizon. Leaders who fell into this pattern might achieve impressive short-term results, but they would systematically undermine the foundations of their own long-term success. The alternative required what Machiavelli described as a higher form of intelligence, the ability to think simultaneously about immediate tactical necessities and long-term strategic consequences, including the character consequences of one's chosen methods. This was far more intellectually demanding than simple cynical calculation, because it required maintaining multiple perspectives simultaneously and understanding complex chains of causation that extended far beyond immediate results. In practical terms, this meant that effective leaders needed to develop what might be called principled pragmatism. They needed to understand their core values clearly enough to see how those values could guide their practical decisions, rather than simply constraining them. They needed to become skilled at finding solutions that satisfied both immediate necessities and long-term strategic objectives. This approach required leaders to invest significant time and energy in understanding the people they led, not as abstract categories to be manipulated, but as individuals with their own motivations, capabilities, and potential for development. It required building relationships based on genuine respect and shared purpose, rather than simply on calculated self-interest. Most importantly, it required leaders to understand that their own character development was not separate from their leadership effectiveness, but was actually the foundation of it. The habits of thought and action that they cultivated in their private lives would inevitably influence their public decision-making. A leader who practiced deception and manipulation in their personal relationships could not simply turn off these tendencies when making policy decisions. The relevance of Machiavelli's analysis to contemporary leadership challenges is striking. In corporate boardrooms, political offices, and organizational hierarchies around the world, the same perilous thought pattern continues to operate with remarkable consistency. Modern leaders facing quarterly earnings pressures, election cycles, or organizational crises repeatedly fall into the same trap that Machiavelli identified 5 centuries ago. Consider the corporate executive who begins by slightly overstating quarterly results to meet analyst expectations, justifying this as necessary to maintain investor confidence and protect employee jobs. This seemingly minor compromise sets in motion the same cascade of consequences that Machiavelli observed in Renaissance princes. The executive becomes increasingly divorced from the actual financial reality of their company, more dependent on financial manipulation to maintain the illusion of success, and gradually surrounded by subordinates who enable rather than challenge this distorted thinking. The pattern culminates in spectacular corporate collapses that seem to surprise everyone involved, but which Machiavelli would have recognized as the inevitable result of systematic self-deception. The executives who led companies like Enron, Lehman Brothers, or Theranos were not necessarily evil people, but they had fallen into a thought pattern that gradually corrupted their capacity for sound judgment. Similarly, political leaders who begin by making strategic compromises with their stated principles often find themselves trapped in the same downward spiral. They justify each compromise as necessary for achieving their larger objectives, but over time these compromises shape their character and their relationships in ways that make those larger objectives increasingly difficult to achieve. The solution that Machiavelli proposed, the integration of principled thinking with strategic effectiveness, remains as relevant today as it was in Renaissance Italy. Modern leaders who achieve sustainable success over long periods tend to be those who have found ways to align their values with their methods, rather than treating these as competing considerations. This does not mean naive idealism or rigid adherence to abstract principles regardless of consequences. Rather, it means developing the intellectual sophistication to see how ethical considerations can guide practical decision-making, and how character development can enhance rather than constrain strategic effectiveness. The leaders who avoid the perilous thought pattern that Machiavelli identified are those who understand that sustainable success requires building authentic relationships, creating institutions based on shared values, and maintaining the kind of personal integrity that enables accurate perception of reality. They recognize that the shortcuts offered by deception and manipulation are actually obstacles to long-term effectiveness. In conclusion, Machiavelli's warning about the most perilous thought pattern was not a cynical observation about the nature of power, but a sophisticated analysis of how certain ways of thinking systematically undermine their own objectives. His insight was that the greatest danger facing any leader was not external opposition or adverse circumstances, but the gradual corruption of their own capacity for sound judgment through the adoption of seemingly pragmatic but ultimately self-destructive patterns of thought. The alternative he proposed, the integration of ethical consideration with strategic thinking, remains one of the most challenging and important tasks facing anyone who aspires to effective leadership. It requires the intellectual humility to recognize that sustainable success depends not just on understanding how to manipulate circumstances, but on understanding how to develop the kind of character that can accurately perceive reality and inspire authentic loyalty. This is why Machiavelli's true message, often obscured by centuries of misinterpretation, remains urgently relevant. In an age of increasing complexity and accelerating change, leaders who fall into the perilous thought pattern of treating ethics as an obstacle to effectiveness will find themselves increasingly isolated, ineffective, and vulnerable to the very forces they sought to manipulate. Those who learn to integrate principled thinking with strategic action will discover that this integration is not a luxury for idealists, but a practical necessity for anyone who hopes to achieve meaningful and sustainable results. The choice between these approaches is not just a moral choice, but a strategic one. As Machiavelli understood, the habits of thought we cultivate shape not only our character but our effectiveness. The most perilous thought pattern is the one that promises short-term advantage at the cost of long-term capacity, and the wisdom to recognize this pattern remains as valuable today as it was when Machiavelli first identified it in the tumultuous politics of Renaissance Italy.